International Cooperation, sir, thank you for being here. Alexander von der Mollem is CEO of Asia Pacific, Europe, EMEA and Germany at Deutsche Bank. Sir, thanks to you for being here. And Minister Janine Munyashuli is Minister of State in charge of Public Investment and Resource Mobilization at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda. Minister Eden will also be joining us later in the session, we hope, if he can come out of his ongoing meeting. So we're looking forward to his contribution as well. So in addressing this issue of global debt, of course, this is an issue that is being faced by countries and regions around the world. And this issue is directly as a result of a series of cascading crises that has triggered a sharp acceleration in global debt. So the focus of our panel is going to be on several things. But first, let's talk about what actions are needed to address the global debt burden and to avert a widespread debt crisis. So I'll open the conversation up to the panel with that question first and foremost. Governor, perhaps would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a governor of JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, official Japanese institution that support Japanese business, investment and trade abroad. And as we are starting to talk about how to fix the debt problem, I would rather first argue that debt is not a problem. Debt is not a four-letter word, although it is four-letter. Debt is the only source of consumption and investment. You have to borrow in order to spend and invest. And that is the only reason we work and save. So how you borrow, how you make debt, how you incur debt is the first problem. You have to borrow wisely and spend wisely, and you have to lend wisely. So we have to think back what we have done, and the complacency is where that before many crises happened, as in portrayed. And we have had so many debt problems in the past as well. So why this time is different? Yes, it is different. We have had so many crises and crises and crises. And that is partly man-made, and that is partly because of natural disasters. And some countries in Africa are more hit, sub-Saharan Africa are more hit than others. And some countries in this region in the Middle East are also very, very hardly hit. So we have to tackle each problem, but we have to tackle these problems one by one. There has been initiative by G20 countries and the Paris Club to suspend some of the debt service. And also, they have come up with a common framework to address the restructuring of debt of low-income countries. By using such framework, we have to work one by one what each country needs and how to address the debt problem of those countries that are faced. I know the effort has been too slow and too small, but we have to do it. We have to continue to do it. And in the case of Asian countries, Japan feels more and more responsive. That is why Japan led with India the debt problem of Sri Lanka. And we are working very hard to reach an agreement so that the IMF can have a lending program, and also we can have more grants and more concession loans to Sri Lanka. And then we can invite private investors making investment. That is how we sequentially going to work.
Thank you, Governor. So, Minister, I'll bring it over to you next. What's driving national and global debt levels, in your opinion, and where are the realities of rising debt burdens being felt the most?
Thank you. I'd like to react to what my neighbor said, but I will do that later. I think it's also important to remember that even before 2019, debt was already on the rise. I remember both the IMF and the World Bank actually warned African countries to be careful about debt management. But back then, what the warning was about was the then shocks. It meant lower growth, it meant depreciation of the national currency and things like those. Then came the COVID, and the shocks then took a whole different magnitude because the bank and the fund have this way of assessing debt, the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis. And back then, really, the shocks were some of those things that were predictable. And then we have a pandemic, we have climate change catastrophes hitting us hard. So we hit a whole different scale of shocks. And on my continent, you have 21 countries that have been now pushed into the category that we call high debt distress or at risk of it. It's new, it's completely unprecedented, pretty much like those shocks. Prior to that, as I was saying, both the bank and the fund were warning countries, be careful, manage your buffers. But those buffers have been completely eroded. And 4 years later, we are 2024, we not only have those countries on my continent that have, are in this red zone category, I would call them on that row, and really no buffers. So it's unprecedented, I think, on our continent. And I would have a few things to say about the global framework, but maybe not now. What is important also to know is that my own country, once we were I think in 2020, the two institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, came with the possibility to have debt suspension. It was a mechanism they called DISS. And we refused, Rwanda refused, and we said we're going to continue to service our debt in our own particular way. And we went on the markets in 2021. And with the Eurobond, we have been able to retire some of those loans and continue to fund our growth. So it's been an extremely prudent approach. Not all countries have succeeded in so doing. And it's a tricky one, really. It's a tricky one.
Mm. Absolutely. And Alex, could you speak to this as well, particularly from a lender's perspective?
Without trying to increase the problem, but I want to go one step back maybe in terms of just describing what has happened over the last couple of years as we've been exposed to all these poly-crises, obviously government spending, having to give a lot of money basically into the system, money of which it's very hard to kind of retract at a later point in time. And the one thing that with the rising level of inflation all around the globe and consequently the higher interest rates, what has occurred that we didn't really see in the Western world for the last decade or so is the return of positive real rates. So why is that a relevant factor? It's a normal factor to begin with because capital as an input factor cannot be for free. We don't come to work for free. Natural resources are not free. Your food is not for free. Why would capital be for free? Yet in the extraordinary environment that we've been in over the last decade plus, in particular in the dollar and the euro-denominated parts of the world, we've seen negative real rates. And what that means is you've effectively been incentivized to borrow money because you could inflate out to a certain extent your existing debt stock. Now, we are having this regime shift into what we would probably forecast to remain in place. And what that means is not only a deceleration, obviously, of monetary flows and a lack of stimulus as a consequence to the real economies, but you're seeing an increased debt burden just because of the servicing of the existing stock. And this has nothing to do with developing markets or emerging markets. This is affecting everyone, all governments, private individuals, corporates, financial institutions. And the most prominent example in this regard is the US Treasury. The United States, just for servicing its existing debt stock, needs to spend $1 trillion, $1 trillion, which means in itself its debt is increasing further. Yeah? In the US, we're heading probably for a debt to GDP ratio of 140%. That is quite mind-blowing. But what that also means is it's crowding out. Within the capital markets, there's always somebody who needs to buy the debt or guarantor loans, and we can debate on who should take what components, but there's a global competition, again, between privates, between corporates, between government and the like. And this rising debt burden, just because of a normalization of interest rates in the world, is creating an additional problem, and this is what we need to be mindful of.
Mm. All right, very fascinating. And I also wanted to make a very warm welcome to Minister Eden, who has just joined us on stage. Sir, that's what we call a classy arrival. So thank you so much for making
Thank you very much. And of course, apologies.
Thank you so much for making the time to be with us. So, over to you, Minister, and to put you on the spot as soon as you sit down. The panel has been talking about addressing the global debt burden and the actions needed and required to address this issue to avert a widespread crisis. Perhaps you could talk to us about this from the Nigerian perspective, what you're seeing in country right now and the wider impact across the region, sir.
Thank you very much. You know, from a developing world perspective, first of all, of course, at this period of still heightened interest rates, and of course, with the developing world in particular, but also many other places not really having recovered from the setbacks of the COVID era and other setbacks since then, the debt issue has become critical. Debt sustainability is a big thing for developing countries as a whole. And I've just come, obviously, from a meeting of the annual general meeting of the Islamic Development Bank. And the talk there is of more concessional funding. And it's chiefly because at this particular time, for the poor countries that have had a reversal since the COVID pandemic, to the extent that they've gone back, they've lost basically the last decades of development that have basically been reversed. And so the answer to debt is revenues. I mean, as we've just heard, the US has 140% debt to GDP ratio, but because the trillions are there to service it, it basically works. For us in Nigeria, we have relatively low debt to GDP level, around 40%. So that's not the issue. The issue is on the revenue side. And what we've had to do, of course, is to look, first of all, to recover our oil revenues, which, because of various dislocations, actually the production is down. But in addition to that, we've had to look to domestic resource mobilization, which is the other answer. If you have heightened debt levels, then you need to get equity. You need to get revenues. And we've added, we've used digitization. We've used technology to increase domestic revenues, basically.
It's a fascinating situation in Nigeria, and while we have you, I think it's also important to maybe just broaden the conversation out, looking at some of the macroeconomic conditions. Nigeria has been hiking interest rates to fight inflation and stabilize the naira, which has been the worst performing global currency since 2022. That, of course, also increases the cost of servicing foreign debt. So how do you contain inflation domestically and stop the naira's slide, which is ultimately making the debt situation worse?
Well, I think that's the challenge, that's the conundrum. We've seen, I'll use the US as an example again. We've seen in the US a robust battle against inflation through increased interest rates, and yet at the same time, consumer demand has been there. The demand to drive the economy has been there. And that's what we're looking to do in Nigeria. Clearly, given the inflationary trend that we had as a result of really some macroeconomic adjustments which had long been overdue, we had to, Mr. President took the bold decision to remove the fuel subsidy. We normalized the exchange rate, and effectively that had an inflationary spike. And in order to combat that, of course, the central bank moving to what they called orthodox monetary policy, raised interest rates. But there's a fiscal cost, as you just mentioned. As the central bank raised interest rates, it meant the government had to fund itself at a higher rate. And we've had to deal with that. And at the same time, look to help the poorest and the most vulnerable. So we not only have looked for revenues to meet debt service, heightened debt service obligations. In addition, we've looked for revenues, we look for equity to intervene on behalf of the poorest and the most vulnerable. The challenge is on, and I think that for countries such as us, we have to maintain and be determined in that battle against inflation in order to stabilize the economy, bring interest rates down eventually so you can grow, invest and grow the economy. But in the meantime, it is a challenge, and it is a lot of pain for the whole of the society, but we must continue to intervene on behalf of the poorest and the most vulnerable through this difficult period, which concessional financing by the multilaterals at scale will really help. And I think it's, if we really mean that we do not want to leave anybody behind as the world develops, as the fourth industrial revolution takes off, as we move to AI and generative AI, we need to increase concessional financing so as not to leave so many countries behind.
Not to labor the point here, but of course, Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa. There are very ambitious reforms underway in the country, and you have alluded to some of them, but the latest economic growth projections are certainly not as optimistic as President Tinubu perhaps expected. So where are you going wrong with your current economic policies, and how are you going to get a handle on this?
Well, I think we went wrong in the past. We went wrong up to 29th of May 2023 when President Bola Ahmed Tinubu assumed office. Since then, I believe we followed the right macro-fiscal policies. We followed the right monetary policies. And we are beginning to see the effect, positive effect. As you mentioned, the exchange rate has improved, has stabilized, and in fact appreciated. But more importantly than that, we're on the verge of bringing down inflation through very, very good agricultural harvests. A lot of funding has been put into the agricultural sector, inputs, seeds, fertilizer, and also increasing the acreage under production. That throughout, and we have 2 harvests a year. One is currently on, and with the reduction in food prices, reduction in inflation, that will be the beginning of the turnaround. In addition, the focus is on those main drivers of the economy that you normally have, infrastructure, and in addition, construction through funding of mortgages. You talked about crowding out in the financial sector. We actually have had a situation where the long-term savings of pensioners was actually put into short-term securities. By correcting that, we'll have affordable mortgages. That should lead to a construction boom, and that is one of the ways out, one of the ways towards growth of the economy. So that's our plan.
Minister Munyasholi, I'd be curious to get your response to that as well, because I guess there is a view forming that you can grow out of a debt problem. To what extent what happens in Nigeria ultimately ends up impacting Rwanda as well?
There are many similarities to begin with. The conundrum he spoke about and the solutions, the main solution, at least on our side as policymakers, we remain fiscal responsibility. As he said, domestic resource mobilization, and most of the time for us, it's a double strategy. Because as a growing country, a developing country, we need to broaden the tax base, and that's difficult in times of fiscal consolidation. But we also need to use all the technologies that we can and leverage it to have better tax administration. We have digitized our tax system, and it has yielded results. We also are dropping some incentives we used to give, some goods that were subsidized. We are also dropping some subsidies. It will have consequences on consumption, but we are taking those difficult decisions because we really have to have a good control of public spending and good public spending management. But that said, it won't be enough. What matters the most, as Minister Edun said again, is to work on the macro fundamentals. Which type of investment do we need to make in terms of that will generate the growth we need to grow both the GDP, but also exports, but also revenues as a whole. And this is really, I think, our challenge as Nigeria's challenge, as the continental challenge, really. And us as a landlocked country, we have a trade balance that is largely in deficit because we import a lot. And this is also a double burden. Not only do we import, but we import in dollars. And not like the Naira, but the Rwandan franc also has devaluated a lot last year. We are in a better shape now. Inflation is under control. It has taken the central bank to take really tough measures. It's very similar. So you see, what we can do is both on the fiscal consolidation, fiscal responsibility, and at the same time really work hard on making sure that we can invest. We can still make those investments because how do you broaden the tax base if you can't bring your kids to school, if you can't feed the population correctly, if you can't provide basic health services? So really, the crowding out of the funds that we need is real. We are pleading, this week we had the IDA replenishment week, to get more concessional loans. Really, we have the same issues, more long-term loans, cheaper loans. You know, it used to be 15 years. Can we have longer maturities? Can we have lower rates? It was good to be last week or the week before in DC and to have at least the fund and the World Bank actually also being sensitive to our issues, because without that space, without creating space for us, it won't be possible for most countries. Mm. I wanted to also react to my neighbors on the G20 framework for that. It not only is small, but it always comes late. If there's one thing that we need to completely prevent and avoid is the stigma of default. No country wants to be there because coming out of it is a whole problem. So the framework, I think, doesn't work. It doesn't work, and more developed countries, lenders will have to work better with us on the borrowing side to make sure we don't get and we don't reach those unsustainable levels of debt. And I think that's where we need to work even closely with all the MDBs and certainly bilateral partners to get more instruments. I've seen a lot of creativity and innovation in the space of climate finance. I don't know exactly what Deutsche Bank does, but we've seen a number of banks bringing instruments like swaps, debt for nature, and we are going to be considering all those instruments to make sure that we can have a good mix of concessional debt.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Alexander, I'll let you respond and reply to that.
Let me explain what Deutsche Bank does and how we can help in this context. No, you're spot on. I think, by the way, I think the answer to this complex situation is obviously not one you can form in one sentence, right? It needs to be a holistic support mechanism, and private institutions are a part of that. You're also alluding to the DFIs. Ultimately, I think some real good work was done, in particular, in during the period of COVID, in responding and. Well, it's not debt forgiveness, but at least making sure that a bridge was found for a period of 2 years in terms of debt servicing. In the meantime, I think there's more governance changes in the pipeline, but now with higher interest rates and other factors, the likely chance that we will have more countries coming into a situation where debt restructuring or a situation where more holistic global support is needed is warranted. We probably need to go for additional and creative measures in order to help those countries. That for nature swaps is something we're very actively supporting in this regard. I think it's a great mechanism that is still not utilized. It's an early new kid on the block, but it is a mechanism that will be helpful for so many countries in the developing market universe. That Western organizations, private institutions will be very supportive of, generally. We're talking about the trillions of dollars every year that the Western world needs to bring to the table in order to fund the carbon neutrality initiatives. Now, here is an important contributor, and over and above it does something good for the societies and those economies that can point towards a relief. Private institutions need to come to the table. I think it's extremely relevant, talking about consistency and stability. I will always point to the Asian financial crisis 20 years ago. Deutsche Bank has been one of the few Western banks that maintained in those countries. It stayed in the countries in the darkest hours. Now that's important, because while business is far from being easy, you know, the financial system needs to work in those countries, and no country on the planet can isolate itself, wants to isolate itself, maybe from, you know, with one or two exceptions. And as a consequence, you need to have financial institutions, both domestic and global ones, that are supporting your economy in good times and bad times. And you know, import of capital is another relevant factor that those very financial institutions can support and want to support. Sometimes, you know, incremental help from the respective governments is certainly helpful in order to allow you know, the activity level of private banks to move forward. But it's really an equation of many factors. And Minister Edun also pointed to another factor, right? Capital market reforms, or however you want to call it. You mentioned the example of bringing together, you know, short-term, you know, liabilities, or theoretically long-term liabilities that are available even within your own remit, to make them and deploy them for long-term investments in your country. That is something that, you know, requires the government, requires the maybe legislative and the regulatory universe to bring in. And then, so it's you know, it's plentiful of items, but coming back to the DFIs, there is clearly additional work needed. And, you know, to give one example, you know, the balance sheet of the IMF, of the World Bank, and the other institutions are limited, naturally limited. We probably need to think about unfunded formats, so guarantee provisioning that then enables private institutions, banks, insurance companies, other money providers to come in, to step in, but having somebody in the back who can support the financial support.
So you are the banker sitting on the stage, so I think it's worthwhile maybe just probing this a little bit further here. To the governor's point, and it was an excellent point earlier, debt is not necessarily a bad thing in some cases. Debt is a critical enabler of future economic growth. But Deutsche Bank has also played a pretty key role here in extending a lot of credit globally. So help me understand how you can tighten up standards and make sure that this is sustainable, transparent, and I guess accountable from a lending and borrowing perspective. How do you make sure that your standards are high enough to drive this in a responsible way?
You're absolutely right. Those standards are relevant, not just with respect to compliance and, you know, the regulatory framework we operate on. It's their reputational elements. There's the overall ESG framework, which, by the way, is still developing for all of us as well. So we need to bring all these components together, and it requires a degree of transparency. That being said, I would say that in many of the developing markets we're implicitly talking about here today have made significant progress in this regard. Yes, one overarching problem, and that's also to the point on why do even, you know, IMF and World Bank supported mechanisms, sometimes it feels like it takes so long. But we also need to recognize that, you know, a lot of documentation is needed. But there's also the element of we do need to avoid the moral hazard problem, which is something that has been around forever and will be around forever. And we kind of need to collectively, you know, the supplier as well as the demand side of capital need to continuously work on further improvement. It has improved, I will, you know, if you compare a situation today with 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, through each iteration and each crisis, I think the stabilization mechanisms are improving. But, you know, there is a certain level of risk-taking willingness you need to overcome. I want to maybe one point on when does risk capital, whether it's from banks or other private money supporter, why is certain money not going into certain countries or maybe certain organizations for that matter, right? Generally, there is risk appetite in the planet. People do recognize a higher risk need to come with a higher price tag, but there's lots of pockets of money, some of which only want to operate in the high-risk company. The one item where certainly governments can help themselves at times is provide a degree of stability. With stability, I don't mean forecasting the economic development, but political stability. You were just pointing towards the very significant progress you have made, right, from stopping the decline of the currency and a much more positive prospect on Nigeria. If Mehmet would be with us now, Turkey has also made significant progress over the last couple of quarters on exactly that, moving to an orthodox monetary policy, moving to a degree of predictability of actions from the government holistically. That brings capital on the table. Still need to discuss the price thereof, but the binary decision that often is holding the private sector back can sufficiently be overcome by bringing this degree of stability.
All right, I wanted to shift the conversation over to the next level here. The Forum has been doing great work on this, and its own research says about 3.3 billion people, or almost half of humanity, now live in countries that spend more money paying interest on their debts than on education and on health. It's an extraordinary statistic. So what immediate steps should be taken by policymakers, lending agencies, the private sector, high-level organizations to forestall a potential debt crisis? And what are the main challenges to implementing some of these steps? Governor, we'll bring it over to you. And in so doing, I'll say to our participants as well, if you have a question for anyone on the panel, we will get to that. Please just raise your hand and we'll try and bring you in as well. But Governor, maybe you can begin by tackling that question.
Well, there have been many comments addressed to me, so I will, a few words on the fiscal consolidation and investing wisely to broaden the tax base. It's not just for the countries in the emerging markets, it's for us as well. Mm-hmm. Japan's government debt to GDP ratio is over 200%, because we have been very complacent on how we spend. So, but there's no free debt, so we have to pay back. That's our domestic political problem, challenging problem. But we have to handle it anyway. And in the international arena, there is still the dearth of concessional money. We will bilaterally continue to give grants and concessional funding. And also through MDBs, we would like to take a responsibility. And as you said rightly, DSSI is not enough. And there is a stigma issue. So we came up with a common framework, and at the spring there was recognition of that issue and agreement on how to strengthen more and more the concessional funding through MDBs. Yes, so these are how we work, and my position is to let the private sector do more business in countries like in Africa. So we are bringing private investors to find a solution. It can be either IPP, public-private partnership, where the investors do take the risks, but at the same time, the government and the ministries have to take some of the risk they can take and lay out the situation. Or we bring in investors in samurai bonds, which is the yen-denominated bond issuance in Tokyo. We did the transaction with Mexico in order to fund the southern states, poorer states, for their educational, medical, and social infrastructure needs. We also invested in the Indonesian government's samurai bond or blue bond, which tries to protect the marine environment and revive the marine econosphere. So by bringing more and more private investments in such important social sectors is what we try to do, on top of bringing more clean energy to those countries with private companies. But that issue has to be dealt each by each through the framework that I have explained, and advanced countries, also MDBs, have to be responsible for their for whatever she has to do. That's, I think, what the international community is struggling to do.
If I may, we've been discussing the debt crisis, but for the population you mentioned, 3.3 billion human beings on this planet, the question is not the debt crisis, it's the deepening of the development crisis. And unlike a loan that you can carry forward arrears in development are not carried forward. If you have a development crisis, chances are you're going to have a debt crisis, but it will translate into social unrest, political unrest, and you don't want to imagine the cascade of other crises that would come. So literally, it's in the interest of everyone to understand the rest of the humanity that is not, is facing the debt. What we're calling the debt crisis is the issue at the core of it is development. We borrow to fund development. And once you understand it, you would say, what is the case to develop Africa? Japan is present. Actually, we have a good relationship with JICA. And what we are doing with them is to make sure that the large infrastructure projects, some of them we have, are co-funded with them. But also the private sector, it's not for Deutsche Bank, but with other players. PPPs will have a large part to play. Even if a developing country has a small stake, it still is an important one to make sure that we crowd in and attract good and quality equity investors in. Because literally the conundrum will be, let's not have to debate between debt and development. Development must come first. That must be clear. It also means for developed countries writing off debt. For the most vulnerable countries, it's not only a moral issue, it actually is a geopolitical issue. It's the issue of, are we living on the same world? What will you do if you have billions of people who cannot live in the countries they live in because they have failed to receive, basic needs covered? So I think addressing the debt, the global debt issue must be calibrated to the situation of the countries we're talking about. And second, should be bold. If we have timid attempts like the J20 framework, like the DSSI we had during the COVID, it won't work. It won't work. Some of the debt needs to be written off and make sure that growth is back. Make sure that growth is back. Our continent in particular has a potential great demographic dividend. It's the continent on which you will see a growing middle class that will, needs to have its power purchase grow. It will be doing a lot of things for the rest of humanity. And if these people are not seen as a market and a more and more integrated market, we are missing an opportunity for everyone. Last but equally important for all of us, there is the climate crisis. So we can't just, isolate ourselves. Literally, we can't. And on that front, the most vulnerable countries also will need exceptional measures and treatment. The issue of debt will not be their issue only. You don't want to see nations wiped off because you didn't take the bold measures. So it's really about, I would say, political will mostly.
Alexander, do you have a view on that as well?
No, I can totally see this. I mean, we're talking massive numbers, obviously, at the same time, in the bigger scheme of things. And coming back to the example of, how much climate change, fighting climate change does cost in the foreseeable future, the double positive effect you can generate by, for instance, a debt for nature swaps into Africa and other locations could be significant and is still underutilized as a gadget.
And Minister, I'll leave you with the last word of the panel as well. Maybe you can provide some concluding remarks here.
Thank you very much. I think my sister, Minister Munyashili, has really put it well. We are talking about the debt crisis, but really it's a development crisis. But at the same time, and you so dimensioned it for us, more spent on debt servicing than health and education in half the world. So definitely it is much more than just a debt crisis. It's a crisis of development. But as Governor Hayashi has put it, the ultimate answer given the way the world is going, or currently, the ultimate answer is private money. There's much more private money out there than government funding, than bilateral and even multilateral development banks. But to get there, you need to have stability, predictability. As CEO Alexander has put it earlier, you need those preconditions before the funding can come. And in the meantime, we have to be creative. As CEO said, guarantees. As my sister said, the minister, debt for nature swaps, all have to come to the table. But at the end of it all, there has to be a commitment. Given the gap that is now opening up, there has to be a commitment to put down sufficient funds, concessionary funds, which effectively is equity, at sufficient scale to really give these countries a chance to stabilize and put themselves back on the path for growth. Yes, the countries have to be determined and committed in their macroeconomic management. And finally, in all this, we must remember the poor and the most vulnerable, and they shouldn't be made to bear the brunt of the cost of whether it's mistakes or whether it's natural disasters, whatever the case, as we try to work our way out of debt, work our way out of recession. We need to put at the forefront assistance and help to the poorest and most vulnerable. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much for those remarks. And I think we are rapidly running out of time, so we might wrap up the panel at this juncture. Ladies and gentlemen, please make our expert panelists feel welcome, and thank you so much for your contribution.